The story of Lexington and Concord is the story of how a revolution began. How ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers stood up to one of the most powerful empires in the world. It was April 1775, in the small villages of Massachusetts, when the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. Those shots, echoing across the countryside, would come to be known as the shot heard around the world. For years before that moment, tension had been building between the 13 American colonies and Great Britain. The British government had piled on taxes on tea, paper, glass, and other goods, claiming it was the colonists' duty to help pay for the empire's wars. But the colonists had no representatives in Parliament, and they began to shout the phrase that would become famous: "No taxation without representation." To them, it wasn't just about money. It was about rights and freedom. Boston had become the heart of resistance. The people there had protested, organized boycotts, and even thrown British tea into the harbor during the Boston Tea Party. The British government responded with force, sending thousands of soldiers to occupy the city and enforce strict new laws. The tension between the red-coated soldiers and the colonists grew worse each day. Angry words turned into shoving matches, and shoving matches turned into bloodshed, like the Boston Massacre in 1770, when soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. By 1775, the situation was ready to explode. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor of Massachusetts, had been ordered to crack down on the rebellion. His spies told him that colonial militias, groups of local men who called themselves Minutemen because they claimed to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, were gathering weapons and gunpowder in the countryside. The largest cache, Gage learned, was stored in the town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. The general decided to act quickly and secretly. He would send troops by night to seize the weapons before the colonists could use them. But secrecy was difficult in a land already buzzing with rumors. In Boston, the Patriots had their own network of spies, and they soon learned about Gage's plan. One of them, a silversmith named Paul Revere, was told that British soldiers were preparing to march. Revere, along with William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, rode out into the night to warn the countryside. As he galloped through the dark villages, he shouted his famous warning, "The British are coming!" Church bells rang, drums beat, and men grabbed their muskets. The quiet New England night was suddenly alive with movement. Just before dawn on April 19, 1775, around 70 Minutemen gathered on the village green in Lexington, a small farming community along the road to Concord. Their leader, Captain John Parker, was a veteran of earlier wars. He told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The morning was cold and misty as the red-coated British troops approached, led by Major John Pitcairn. The soldiers were tired after marching through the night, their boots muddy, their nerves tight. As the two sides faced each other, a silence fell. Then suddenly, a shot rang out. No one knew who fired first, but that single crack of a musket shattered the tension. The British troops opened fire. Smoke filled the air and chaos erupted. When it was over, 8 colonists lay dead and 9 more were wounded. The British shouted in victory and marched on toward Concord, leaving the dead behind on the grass. When the British reached Concord, they began searching for the hidden weapons, but the Patriots had already moved most of them. Frustrated, the soldiers set fire to a few supplies they did find, and the smoke rose above the town. On a nearby hill, hundreds of armed militiamen from surrounding villages saw the smoke and thought the British were burning their homes. Furious, they marched toward the North Bridge, where a small group of British soldiers stood guard. As the colonists approached, they were met with warning shots. Then once again someone fired, and the fight began. Unlike at Lexington, this time the colonists fired back in organized volleys. The British were forced to retreat, leaving behind several dead and wounded. It was at that bridge that a poet, years later, would write the immortal words, "Here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world." The British had expected to face scattered farmers. Instead, they found themselves under attack from all directions. As they marched back toward Boston, thousands of angry colonists poured from the hills, farms, and forests, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and fences. The narrow country roads turned into killing grounds. The British columns, redcoats gleaming in the sun, were easy targets for men who knew every twist of the terrain. By the end of the day, the British Army had lost more than 270 men killed, wounded, or missing. The colonists had lost around 90, but they had driven the mighty British Army back to Boston. When the news spread across the colonies, it electrified the people. Farmers, tradesmen, and laborers grabbed their muskets and headed for Boston. Within days, more than 15,000 militiamen surrounded the city, trapping the British inside. The American Revolution, the fight for independence, had begun. But in that moment, no one knew what the future would hold. The colonists were still technically British subjects, and not everyone wanted independence. Many hoped for peace and reconciliation. Even George Washington, who would soon become commander of the Continental Army, still spoke of loyalty to the king. Yet the events at Lexington and Concord changed everything. The colonies could no longer pretend that the conflict was just political. The blood spilled on those fields made compromise almost impossible. The British, humiliated and angry, realized that they were not fighting a small band of rebels, but an entire population ready to resist. General Gage called for reinforcements from England, and the British government declared Massachusetts to be in open rebellion. Across the Atlantic, the news shocked Parliament and King George III. They believed the colonists would be crushed easily, but they underestimated the strength of their desire for liberty. For the colonists, Lexington and Concord became symbols of courage and unity. Ordinary men had faced trained soldiers and survived. The stories of Paul Revere's ride and the brave stand of the Minutemen spread like wildfire. Pamphlets and newspapers celebrated their bravery. Artists painted scenes of the battles, showing heroic farmers standing tall against the empire. Churches rang their bells, and towns held ceremonies to honor the fallen. In the following weeks, the colonies began to organize. Delegates met at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia to decide their next steps. They created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. Though the Declaration of Independence would not be written until the following year, the seeds of freedom were already planted. The phrase, "the shot heard around the world," became more than just a line in a poem. It symbolized the idea that the struggle for liberty in one small corner of the world could inspire people everywhere. And indeed it did. Decades later, revolutionaries in France, Latin America, and beyond would look to the American example as proof that ordinary people could overthrow tyranny. The battlefields of Lexington and Concord still exist today, quiet and green, surrounded by modern homes and roads. But if you stand there in the early morning, you can still imagine the sound of drums, the smell of gunpowder, and the courage of the men who faced impossible odds. The old stone walls and bridges remain as reminders that freedom often begins not with grand speeches, but with small acts of defiance, a warning shouted in the night, a line of farmers refusing to step aside, a single musket fired in fear and determination. Those who fought that day didn't know they were making history. They were fighting for their families, their homes, and their right to live free from oppression. But their courage changed the course of human events. The British Empire, which once stretched across the globe, would begin to crumble, while the idea of self-government, of a people ruling themselves, would take root and spread. The story of Lexington and Concord is not just about war, it's about identity. It marks the moment when the American people began to see themselves as something different, something new, not just subjects of a distant king, but citizens of their own nation. It reminds us that revolutions don't begin with politicians. They begin with ordinary people who decide they've had enough. And so, when we speak of the shot heard, around the world we are not only remembering a gunshot on a quiet morning in April 1775, we are remembering the spark that lit the fire of freedom, a fire that would burn across continents and centuries. From the green fields of Massachusetts to the halls of democracy around the world, its echo can still be heard today. Because sometimes one small moment in one small village can change everything.